In today's video, we deep dive into the intense and complex years of American foreign policy during and after President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration, a period marked by Cold War rivalries, nuclear tension, secretive diplomacy, and world-shaping events from Cuba to China and from Berlin to Tehran. Let's get started. When Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president in 1952, he inherited President Truman's policy of containing communism. But Eisenhower, wary of the enormous cost of maintaining large conventional forces, worried that unchecked defense spending could bankrupt the nation. Still, he didn't want the Soviets to mistake any military cutbacks as weakness. So, with his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower introduced a new look to American defense policy. The United States would reduce reliance on ground troops and instead lean heavily on air power and nuclear weapons. Dulles introduced the idea of massive retaliation, a strategy in which the United States promised to use nuclear weapons if it felt its interests were threatened. He also promoted Brinksmanship, claiming that the United States must be willing to go to the brink of war to preserve peace. This raised tensions around the world during the 1950s and made the threat of nuclear war a daily reality. The arms race began in earnest after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Japan in 1945, sparking global debates about the morality of nuclear warfare. Just 4 years later, in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb. By 1952, the United States exploded a hydrogen bomb, followed by a Soviet test in 1953. Both nations raced to build up stockpiles and develop missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads. In response, Eisenhower proposed the Atoms for Peace Plan at the United Nations in 1953, hoping to focus nuclear technology on peaceful uses. But the Soviet Union refused to join the effort. Fearful of nuclear conflict, Americans began building fallout shelters in schools, homes, and public spaces. Then, in 1957, the Soviets shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Suddenly, the arms race had a new frontier: space. The Cold War's intensity fluctuated during Eisenhower's presidency. Stalin died in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev rose to power, bringing with him a temporary easing of tensions. But that peace was short lived. In 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution, Hungarian citizens demanded democratic reforms. The Soviets responded with tanks, crushing the rebellion and reinstating a pro Soviet regime. The United States was powerless to intervene, and tensions rose. In 1958, Khrushchev demanded that NATO abandon West Berlin. Eisenhower resisted, but diplomatic talks were arranged. Khrushchev even visited the United States in 1959, and Eisenhower planned a visit to Moscow. But those plans collapsed in 1960 when the Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane, capturing pilot Francis Gary Powers. Khrushchev canceled the summit and withdrew Eisenhower's invitation, leaving U.S. Soviet relations more strained than ever. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. At first, the United States recognized his new government, but tensions quickly emerged. Castro restricted civil liberties, imprisoned opponents, nationalized industries, and turned to the USSR for support, making Cuba a communist nation just 90 miles away from Florida. Thousands of Cubans fled Castro's rule, settling in southern Florida. Eisenhower's administration grew increasingly alarmed by Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union. As he prepared to leave office, Eisenhower delivered a historic warning. In his farewell address, he cautioned the nation to guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military industrial complex. He feared the growing influence of defense contractors and the military establishment in shaping U.S. policy. His concern was that America might follow the path of ancient Rome, becoming a militarized empire driven by war. Democrat John F. Kennedy narrowly defeated Eisenhower's vice president Richard Nixon in 1960. He inherited a world on edge. After the Soviets launched the first human into space in 1961, Kennedy responded by committing to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. In 1962, John Glenn orbited Earth, and in 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, a mission that cost $25.4 billion dollars and restored national pride. In Latin America, Kennedy sought to improve U.S. relations and counter communism with the Alliance for Progress, pledging $20 billion dollars for regional development. Unfortunately, much of the aid ended up propping up oppressive governments. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was a disastrous CIA backed effort to overthrow Castro using Cuban exiles. Castro's forces crushed the invasion, embarrassing the United States. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted when Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba. Kennedy announced a naval blockade and demanded removal.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting therefore in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
The United States and the USSR stood at the brink of nuclear war before the Soviets finally backed down and removed the missiles. This moment helped the United States regain some credibility lost after the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1963, the United States, Great Britain, and the USSR signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, banning most nuclear testing. After Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson became president, winning his own term in 1964. But by 1968, worn down by Vietnam, he did not seek another term. Richard Nixon won the 1968 election, and his foreign policy focused on ending the Vietnam War, but he also reshaped global diplomacy. In 1969, Nixon introduced the Nixon Doctrine, stating the United States would no longer provide direct military defense in Asia, effectively saying there would be no more Vietnams. He shocked the world in 1971 by announcing a visit to China, America's enemy since the Communist Revolution in 1949. In 1972, Nixon met with Mao Zedong, opening the door to diplomatic relations and splitting the communist bloc. Meanwhile, Nixon and advisor Henry Kissinger pursued détente with the Soviet Union, a thawing of Cold War tensions. They embraced realpolitik, a strategy of making pragmatic decisions based on national interests rather than ideology. In 1972, Nixon became the first president to visit Moscow. There, he signed the SALT I agreement, limiting the number of missile sites and nuclear weapons both nations could possess. After World War II, the United States became more involved in the Middle East. When Israel declared independence in 1948, the United States quickly recognized the new state. But that recognition inflamed tensions in the region. After Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, Arab nations adopted the Khartoum Resolution, stating no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Liberation Organization launched attacks against Israel, led by Yasser Arafat. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat made history by visiting Israel. The following year, President Jimmy Carter hosted Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin at Camp David. There, they signed the Camp David Accords in 1979. Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel. Sadat was later assassinated by extremists who opposed that very peace. In Iran, 1979 brought revolution. Islamic fundamentalists overthrew the US backed Shah, Reza Pahlavi. When President Carter allowed the ailing Shah to seek cancer treatment in the United States, Iranian militants seized the US embassy in Tehran and took more than 50 Americans hostage. The Iran hostage crisis lasted 444 days before their release. From nuclear brinksmanship and space exploration to secret diplomacy and Middle Eastern conflict, the Cold War shaped the world in ways still felt today. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, and Carter each faced difficult choices in dangerous times. Their decisions, sometimes bold, sometimes flawed, reshaped America's role on the global stage. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.